In mid-August 2024, the first light of morning spilled across the slopes of Rocky Mountain National Park, gilding snow-capped peaks and shadowed valleys in gold. The Bear Lake Trailhead parking lot was already full of hikers, Americans, Europeans, even a few Asian faces bustling with backpacks and cameras eager to disappear into the forest. Among them, a young woman named Liu Xinyue, 27, stood quietly next to her rental car. Her gaze lingered on the jagged skyline, glowing in the sun, her fingers gripping the strap of her pack. A Nikon camera swung lightly against her chest as she tapped out one last message, home heading in. Back Sunday. She didn't look back. Step by deliberate step, Xinyu crossed the weathered wooden gate that marked the start of the trail. Within seconds, her slight figure was swallowed by the lodgepole pines, fading, as if she'd never been there at all. Across the parking lot, a gaunt man leaned against a post, his eyes cold and fixed on her retreating silhouette. No one among the hundreds of cheerful hikers noticed in that bright, perfect morning something dark and silent was already following Xinyue into the deep woods. As the bright sunlight softened into pale streaks through the pine canopy, Xinyue was already deep in the mountains. Each step on the rocky trail sounded quiet but steady, blending into the thin, cool air and the whisper of wind curling through the ridges. She moved deliberately, pausing now and then to adjust her pack straps or lift her Nikon, capturing shafts of golden light or jagged peaks looming in the distance. The trip began as perfectly as she'd hoped. The weather was calm, the sky crystal clear. That first evening, she chose a quiet patch of ground by a small lake, pitched her tent, boiled water, took a few night shots, then slipped into her sleeping bag, dozing off in the high country chill. In her pocket journal, she scribbled, Day 1. Reached camp as planned. So peaceful. The second night, the sky turned gray. Wind pushed harder, whispering through the old pines, and the creak of branches in the dark made her skin crawl. At some point, she woke to an unfamiliar sound, heavy, deliberate, like footsteps grinding through damp leaves just outside. She lay still, straining to hear, telling herself it was only wildlife. These mountains were full of deer, sometimes black bears scavenging by lakes. She willed herself back to sleep, but much later, a faint shiver ran through her as something brushed along the side of her tent. The next morning, she rose late, the air shrouded in mist. On the damp earth outside were faint footprints, uneven, shallow. She couldn't tell if they were animal or human. Quickly she packed up, cinched her straps, and moved on, refusing to let the unease of the night before deter her. The following days, the skies cleared again. But by the third night, the sense of being watched became undeniable. Every time she stopped to rest or frame a shot, she could feel it, a presence lurking just beyond sight, waiting. Sometimes she'd stare into the shadows between trees, her pulse quickening, but nothing ever moved. On her final morning, she made camp early by Odessa Lake, shot a few frames of the evening light, then set her Nikon on her heavy pack, planning to climb a nearby slope for one last vantage point before sunset. In her mind, there was only one thought: finish the portfolio she'd come all this way to create. It was the last time anyone ever saw her. In Shanghai, Sunday night passed quietly. Liu Jiancheng woke Monday morning, opened WeChat, hoping for a message. The screen stayed gray and silent. One day passed, then another. The worry curdled into a quiet panic. He clung to the hope that maybe her battery had died, or she'd decided to spend an extra night in the mountains. But by Tuesday night, his hands trembling, he called the Chinese embassy in Washington. That same evening in Colorado, Ranger Ethan Morales got the call relayed through embassy channels. A young Chinese tourist named Liu Xinyue, 27, missing after entering the Bear Lake Trail over the weekend. No signal. Her rental car still parked at Bear Lake. At dusk, Morales stood by the gray Subaru, staring at the thin film of dust coating the windshield, the neatly folded topo map on the passenger seat. He knew what they were facing wasn't just a hiker who'd lost her way. These mountains didn't swallow people easily, but once they did, they rarely gave them back. He pulled his hat low, standing still in the empty lot, listening to the wind whip through the pines, a sound that heralded a storm coming in more ways than one. The next morning, the Bear Lake parking lot was packed. Dozens of rangers, rescue workers, K9 units, and volunteers in neon jackets clustered around a large topo map stretched across a frame. Red lines circled the Bear Lake flat-top Odessa loop, like a noose drawn tight around the unforgiving wilderness. On a whiteboard behind them, her name was written clearly: Liu Xinyue, 27. China, missing, since 8/11/2024. Ethan Morales stood silently before the map hands, deep in his windbreaker pockets, eyes sharp and unreadable. 20 years in the field had taught him how to read faint signs in the earth, how to peer into the shadows where others saw nothing. But this time, from the very beginning, he sensed something different, an unnatural quiet in the vastness. The teams fanned out quickly, as planned. One group moved clockwise, another climbed flat top, while the helicopters and K9 units worked the high ridges over Odessa. The morning weather held high, cold, steady winds. But the higher they climbed, the mist thickened, wrapping itself around the pine trunks like pale cobwebs. By mid-morning, a forward team crackled through on the radio they'd found her tent. Everyone converged at Odessa Lake. In a small clearing near the water, Xinyu's tent stood perfectly pitched fabric, taut stakes deep and clean as though she were still here. But the clearing was silent, and no fresh tracks marred the earth. Inside, her sleeping bag was already unrolled. Her small day pack lay beside it, empty water bottle, and a torn protein bar wrapper inside. But the heavy pack, the one with her sleeping gear extra food jacket, was gone. So were her boots. Morales crouched by the day pack. He knew no one walked off into the mountains under heavy weight, leaving their day pack behind. That went against everything hikers knew about staying alive. He tugged his cap, lower eyes scanning the dark tree line, as if the old pines themselves might yield some secret. K9s were deployed immediately. A German shepherd named Kaiser quickly picked up a scent from the edge of the tent. His sleek black body disappeared into the willows, his bark echoing back. Morales and the handler followed at a jog, but the trail didn't follow the path. It went straight up a gray slope, littered with loose, scree broken branches and dry leaves. They pressed on, climbing a half-mile, until Kaiser abruptly stopped. He circled, tail low, whining. The scent ended, not faded, ended as though cut. Morales knelt, fingers brushing the cold surface of a flat rock. A heavy weight settled in his gut. He keyed the radio, his voice flat, trail ends. Nothing further. Above them, the helicopter crew swept binoculars across the ridges. From up there, the mountains looked beautiful and merciless. White peaks gleamed in sunlight, the forests rolled like a green ocean, and the black chasms between seemed to swallow everything. All day long, her name was called into the valleys, voices scattered by the wind, swallowed by silence. That evening, the rain came. At first, just fat drops, then a steady driving curtain. Morales stood under the field tent awning, watching the storm wash over the hills. He knew if this rain continued overnight, what little trace was left would turn to mud and memory. Across the world, in a cramped Shanghai apartment, Liu Jiancheng sat frozen before his phone eyes, red, staring at the last picture his daughter had sent her, standing at the edge of the lodgepole forest, hair tied back, wearing a quiet smile, the mountains glowing behind her. A flash of lightning lit the window. He didn't look up. Somehow, deep in her eyes, he already saw the shadow waiting for her in those distant foreign woods. The rain had poured through the night, drenching the steep slopes, washing away the thin layer of dust in the parking lot, erasing what little footprints remained around the tent. By morning, the base camp was nothing but soaked tarps, mud-caked boots, and weary, silent faces. Ethan Morales stood at the edge of the awning, staring into the gray forest beyond. A helicopter rumbled overhead, its blades thrumming like the erratic heartbeat of a search still clinging to hope. But he knew in storms like this, the mountains rarely gave anything back, only wet canvas and cold stakes left behind. By the fourth day, No new signs surfaced. The teams paused at every clearing, eyes combing each crevice, every hollow where Kaiser had last caught her scent. All they found were wet tree trunks, loose stones skittering underfoot, and a silence heavy enough to press into their lungs. On the 5th day, the sky cleared again. But no one felt relief. The line of volunteer vans trickled away. Reporters who'd once crowded the parking lot packed up their cameras and left. Local news aired only brief clips of rangers, parting branches, dogs, sniffing grass, and the same cold tagline: "No trace yet of missing Chinese tourist." At the far end of the command tent, Morales leaned against a beam, his eyes fixed on the big topo map. His finger traced the red loop and stopped at the blank spot where the trail had simply ended. Experience told him she'd stepped off her plan right there. But why and what waited for her beyond that line, no one could say. On the 6th evening, Morales called her parents, now holed up in a cold Denver hotel room. He kept his voice measured as he explained that the search was expanding, but that surviving 6 days in these mountains was unlikely. On the other end, only Liu's heavy breathing filled the line. Not a word. Morales hung up, feeling the weight settle on his shoulders. On the 7th day, a lone hawk swooped low through the camp, its wide wings sweeping dust into the air. To some, it was a bad omen. By the 10th day, the operation officially stood down. Tarps were rolled, maps were folded and sealed away in the case file. Trucks rumbled out of Bear Lake lot, leaving behind nothing but red dust and silence. Only Morales stayed behind, eyes fixed on the ridges where the mountains glowed faintly orange in the dusk, a place where every falling shadow buried another fragile hope. In the Denver hotel, Liu Jiancheng sat by the window, staring at the strange city below, its lights glittering at the foot of the mountains, while the wilderness behind them swallowed what little light remained. His daughter's last photo still glowed on his phone screen, alongside the American's final clinical words. There's nothing left to find. But inside him, a quiet voice whispered, not yet. He refused to believe she was just another name, swallowed by darkness. And that night, as the ranger station drifted into silence, Morales glanced back one last time and noticed the faint glow of a hotel room light still burning on the distant hillside loos. After the rescue crews packed up their tents, the mountains returned to absolute silence. Only the wind swept across the steep slopes, rattling loose branches and soaking the old command ground with nightly rains until it was nothing but mud and memories. While volunteers and reporters moved on, Liu stayed. He switched to a cheaper motel closer to the highway leading into the park. Every morning he rose before dawn, dressed in his weather jacket, and slipped a folded topo map, a notebook, a flashlight, and a small magnifying glass into his pocket. Decades working as a land surveyor in Shanghai had taught him patience, the kind of patience that could measure the world in centimeters. Now he used that same skill to grid the wilderness into small, manageable squares, carefully sketching them on paper, marking each section as he cleared it. His rented pickup truck was often seen, parked on the edge of Bear Lake before sunrise, not returning until long after dark. Slowly, the rangers came to recognize his figure, bent over maps, his flashlight sweeping across dark ridges. They greeted him with quiet respect, sometimes handing him hot coffee, murmuring weather warnings. No one truly believed he would find her, but no one could tell him to stop. Day after day, week after week, Liu traced her last steps. Bear Lake, Odessa. Flat Top, moving through his grid square by square. He no longer hoped to find her alive, but he could not stand the thought of his daughter lying out there alone, cold and forgotten. Sometimes he froze over a damp patch of rock, or picked up a frayed scrap of cloth, or a single fine hair caught in grass. Each time he shook his head, carefully tucked it back, made a note in his book, and moved on. More than a month passed. Summer drained from the valleys, turning the aspens gold and brittle. Snow began creeping back onto the peaks, the skies grew gray. The visitor center parking lot emptied of tourists. The posters with her face, once crisp and urgent, curled and faded in the high-altitude sun. But Liu did not leave. Each night he sat in his motel room under the pale glow of a desk lamp, marking off more squares on his map, planting tiny colored pins over possible sites. His dinners were nothing but cold sandwiches and tea. Sometimes he sent a few quiet messages to his wife back in Shanghai. Then he'd look up at the photo of his daughter taped to the wall, her eyes still lit with the same quiet joy of that morning before the mountains swallowed her. One early October evening, with icy winds already whipping down the ridges, Liu drove back to his motel more slowly than usual. The sun had long gone, the fog clung to his headlights. He stopped the truck on the shoulder, killed the engine, and stared deep into the blackness of the forest ahead. In that moment, he made a silent vow to himself. No matter how long it took, he would not leave until every inch of this wilderness had felt the press of his boots. Winter had come early that year, laying a thin white sheet over the slopes and turning the national park into a silent, frozen sea. Liu stayed on, but his steps grew slower. His hands chapped and cracked from the cold, his map squares filling in more and more slowly. When the snow deepened, he finally retreated home to Shanghai. But as soon as the summer of 2025 returned, with its warm winds and vibrant green pines, Liu was back as if summoned by the thaw, walking the same trails. By now, everyone at Bear Lake knew him, the Asian man with salt and pepper hair, carrying his battered backpack, sitting for hours at the trailhead, staring into the forest like he was speaking to the mountains. The rangers nodded politely, but there was still a quiet sadness in their eyes. Everyone expected this summer to end just like the last, with nothing. But then, on a misty morning in mid-July, a trembling voice crackled over the ranger station radio. I think I found something." It was David Chen, a ranger and bird researcher out surveying eagle nests on a high cliff in Glacier Gorge. He'd climbed up to one of the massive old nests, perched precariously on a ledge, and froze. Woven into the dry branches were things that didn't belong: a strip of faded blue nylon and a frayed band of red fabric tangled tight into the nest, as if it belonged there. Chen felt a chill run through him. He remembered the posters from last summer, the bright-eyed young woman with the blue pack and red straps. And now those same colors sat here, quiet and waiting among the eagle sticks. He stood still for a moment before pulling out his phone hands, trembling as he photographed every angle of the nest, every detail of the fabric. Then he stepped back, breath shallow, and pressed his radio. I think we've got a lead." The news spread like wildfire. The station roared back to life. Desks flipped open, maps unrolled. A new search zone was drawn in red, right where the eagle's nest clung to the cliff. The air was different now, no longer a rescue, but a recovery. The next morning, Liu arrived early. He stood quietly at the edge of the staging area, watching the ridge where Chen had found the nest. He hadn't slept the night before, only stared at his daughter's photo, whispering to himself, "Finally, something. Finally." A helicopter touched down, disgorging a team of forensic anthropologists, cadaver dogs, and high-angle rescue specialists. The rotors whipped the alpine meadow into a storm of dust and grass. The smell of oil and earth hung thick in the air. Everyone knew this was no longer about saving a life. This was about collecting what was left of it. Liu stood next to Morales as the team began their slow ascent of the dark slope. His eyes fixed on the jagged ridge, where at last the mountains seemed ready to give up. The mountain wind whipped up from the valley, cutting across the cliffside, where the recovery team marked out squares, one by one. The terrain here was harsher than anything Morales had seen in decades of rescue work: steep, crumbling scree that slid like marbles underfoot, each step anchored by rope, each patch of earth combed carefully, every stone overturned. The search dogs barked in the distance. Forensic specialists crouched, brushing away thin layers of soil, prying at rocks. No one spoke much. No one dared breathe too loudly. No one promised Liu that today would be any different. Day one passed, then day two. Nothing but dry grass and cold stones, baking under the alpine sun. But on the morning of the third day, just as the first rays of light broke over the ridges, a black Labrador named Odin suddenly stopped. He let out a low whine, his claws scraping at the earth ears, forward eyes fixed on a gnarled clump of brush clinging to the base of the cliff. The handler raised a hand. The team converged. Morales crouched, feeling his heart hammer in his chest like a drum. A forensic anthropologist knelt, her light sweeping over a subtle depression in the soil. Here, she murmured. With delicate trowels and fine brushes, they began to peel back the dark earth centimeter by centimeter. A faint flash of pale blue fabric emerged, a torn technical sleeve. Inches away, a curved, chalky sliver of bone. The group stepped back. Only the wind whistled through the cliffside. Morales lowered his head, closing his eyes. Lou didn't. He stood still, staring, frozen in place. The morning light cut through the clouds and fell across the disturbed soil, cold and unyielding. For hours, they worked methodically, widening the shallow grave. It was barely half a meter deep, yet inside lay human remains, bones, scraps of faded clothing, the last fragments of the life she carried up here. No one spoke. They only documented, photographed, bagged each piece with solemn care. A waiting helicopter thrummed its blades below, ready to ferry the white bags back to town. Liu walked slowly toward it. He said nothing. He didn't cry. He only rested his hand on one of the bags as though to comfort what his daughter had become. That afternoon, the city morgue confirmed the remains belonged to Liu Xinyue. Dental records, clothing remnants, all matched. A terse press release went out. The body of missing tourist Liu Xinyue has been recovered. But the autopsy revealed something far worse. Fractures across her skull. Clear, blunt force trauma, not a fall. Broken ribs, signs of restraint. And unmistakable evidence of sexual assault before death. The autopsy room fell into heavy silence. Morales bowed his head. Liu stood at the doorway, his hands trembling. A forensic technician closed the file and muttered quietly, "This wasn't an accident. This was murder." That evening, the skies over Colorado turned a heavy gray. The peaks disappeared behind clouds. And at last, the mountains gave her back, along with an answer no one wanted to hear. News of Xinyue's death spread quickly from local stations to international headlines. Chinese papers ran stark banners, "Body of missing Chinese tourist found in U.S." In America, reporters crowded the steps of the Denver coroner's office cameras, flashing at the hollow-eyed faces of Liu and Morales. But behind the lights, one question echoed louder than all the others: who killed her? That same night, Morales returned to the county office with an FBI agent assigned to the case. Together they spread out the original file map statements and the crude sketch made from two hikers' memories last year, the gaunt man with the military-style pack and predatory stare. That sketch, folded and buried at the bottom of a dead file for months, was now their most important lead. The image was re-released to evening broadcasts. The sunken eyes and hollow cheeks filled TV screens alongside bold letters, "Murder suspect. If you recognize him, call now." The hotline rang the next night. A desk clerk at a cheap motel in Estes Park recognized the face. She said he'd stayed there for weeks last summer, quiet, always paying cash, leaving no forwarding info. His name in the ledger, David Frazier. He'd checked out abruptly, just days after news of Xinyue's disappearance broke. That name cracked the case wide open. Records showed Frazier, 42, had drifted across the West for years, picking up day labor on ranches and construction sites, leaving no digital footprint. A sealed juvenile record for violence, multiple arrests for disorderly conduct and assault. Agents traced him north through Wyoming and Montana. Finally, they found him on a remote ranch outside Casper, Wyoming. At dawn, a team of FBI and deputies surrounded the weathered shack he lived in and moved in as he stepped out. Frazier didn't resist. He didn't flinch. His eyes were flat and hollow, as if it were all just another chore unrelated to him. In his shack, they found a large steel footlocker padlocked. When they broke it open, the room went quiet. Inside were IDs from missing women across several states, bits of jewelry, braids of hair, and at the bottom, wrapped in a faded shirt, was Xinyue's Nikon camera. The memory card was intact. Morales stood still as the images were projected onto an FBI screen, serene landscapes from her last morning, then darker frames, blurry shots of her being stalked, terrified fighting back, and finally brutal clinical photos of the assault taken by his own hand. In the interrogation room, Frazier sat wordless as those photos were placed before him. He watched each one, his expression blank. Only when a photo of him trailing Xinyue at Bear Lake was slid forward did he nod faintly. "That's me," he said, his voice even. No remorse, no tears. Just a ghost stripped bare, finally stepping into the light. News of David Frazier's confession tore through American and Chinese media like a storm. Headlines called him the ghost of the American West, a drifter invisible for years, who used the vast wilderness and the trust of lone hikers, like his private hunting ground. In Jackson, where the federal courthouse held the trial, the halls were packed with locals, reporters, and the relentless flash of cameras, as Frazier was led in, clad in an orange jumpsuit, handcuffs glinting under the lights. He kept his same glacial stare, sitting motionless at the defense table, as if none of it concerned him. In the front row, Liu and his wife sat close, hands clasped tight. Their faces were etched with exhaustion, eyes red. Before them, the prosecutor methodically laid out the evidence. The autopsy, his own confession, the camera's memory card, the haunting sequence of photographs Frazier had taken himself. The final image silenced the room, Xinyue's body, lifeless eyes, wide in terror, hair tangled in dust, and blood lips parted as though calling for help. Liu turned away, his grip on his wife's hand tightening, but no tears fell. When the prosecutor asked Frazier, "Do you have anything to say to the victim's family?" he only shook his head, his hollow eyes empty, as mute as the mountains that once hid him. The jury deliberated for just over 2 hours. The verdict rang out clear and sharp, guilty of kidnapping, sexual assault, first-degree murder, life in prison without parole. The judge's gavel struck wood, its echo carrying through the chamber. A sentence delivered, a life that could never be returned, and a shadow ripped from Rocky Mountain slopes to reveal the predator beneath. As Liu left the courtroom, he paused at a window, staring out at the towering range in the distance. In his mind's eye, his daughter still stood there, smiling at the edge of the pines, hair catching in the wind, eyes bright with joy, just as she had on that first morning at Bear Lake. He closed his eyes. A long, heavy breath escaped him, as deep and weary as the mountains themselves. After the trial, the town slowly returned to its rhythm. News of the sentence faded from headlines, replaced by fresher stories. But for Liu, life never returned to what it was. He stayed in Colorado for another week, then quietly packed his bags and flew home to Shanghai. On the flight, he scrolled through old photos of Xinyue, her smiling in the sunlight, standing at Bear Lake, eyes bright with joy. He paused at the last photo. She'd sent the message beneath it, still intact, heading in. Back Sunday. When her ashes arrived home, the entire apartment building fell into a hush. A small memorial was held in Shanghai. Friends and co-workers came to light incense, laying white flowers before her portrait. Liu stood still before her photograph, his hand resting on the wooden frame, whispering something no one else could hear. But he didn't cry. He knew that somewhere deep in those mountains, part of her still remained, in the wind, in the pines, in the snow that blanketed the peaks. The following summer, he returned to Colorado. This time he carried no maps, no notebook. He parked at Bear Lake and sat for hours, staring across the water. As dusk fell, he walked slowly to the tree line, lifting his gaze to the ridges, bathed in the fiery glow of sunset. For a long time he simply stood there, then gave a faint nod. His eyes narrowed, looking far into the distance. Perhaps for him the promise to his daughter was finally kept. He had brought her home, and she would never again be left alone in the dark. In the distance, the mountains still stood, catching the first light of dawn and swallowing the secrets of men in their cold, silent crevices. To Liu, the wilderness would always be where she belonged, beautiful, harsh, and undefeated. On the shore of Bear Lake, the wind moved through the pines, their hushed whispers calling her name across the jagged cliffs.